John, a 9-year-old boy with a strong sense of justice, always believed that he had to stand up for the people he loved no matter how difficult it was. On what should have been his mother's happiest day, John made a decision that changed everything. When he saw his mother preparing to marry Richard, a man hiding dangerous secrets, John bravely stepped forward and revealed a shocking truth that no one could have expected. His courageous act immediately halted the wedding, but what happened afterward left everyone in disbelief. Why did John's revelation lead to such severe consequences? How did this young boy's courage expose the truth about his mother's fiancé, and how would it impact their future? Stay tuned to find out, and before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story about courage and honesty touches your heart, do not forget to hit that subscribe button. The life of John and his mother had always been simple and peaceful, ever since John's father passed away in a car accident 2 years ago. Losing his father was the greatest shock of John's life, and from that moment on, he always felt responsible for protecting his mother, Sarah, a kind and loving woman. The bond between mother and son was incredibly strong. They were not just mother and child, but also the closest of companions. Every evening they would read books together, watch old family movies that they both loved, and always share stories about their lives. To John, his mother meant everything. Despite being so young, he always paid attention to her mood and noticed even the slightest changes in her expressions or words. After his father passed, Sarah devoted all her time and care to John, but John knew his mother needed happiness, and someone to be by her side too. This became even clearer when Sarah met Richard, the man she had been dating for several months. Richard was a successful businessman, tall and handsome, with a smile that always lit up his face, and an air of sophistication whenever he appeared. He entered Sarah's life like a savior, bringing back feelings she had not felt in a long time after her husband's death. The first time John met Richard was at a small party his mother threw at their house to introduce her new boyfriend to family and friends. Richard arrived with a vibrant bouquet in hand, a bright smile, and an air of confidence that captivated everyone. "John, this is Richard," my friend Sarah introduced him to the boy. Richard knelt down, looking directly at John with a friendly smile. "Nice to meet you, John. Your mother has told me so much about you. I hope we can be great friends." At that moment, John only managed to faint smile, unable to feel any genuine warmth toward Richard. But to keep his mother happy, he remained polite and did not protest. As time went by, Richard appeared more frequently in John and Sarah's life. He often came over for dinner, took John's mother out, and sometimes even played basketball with John in the backyard. Richard seemed like the perfect man, always taking good care of Sarah, and all her friends and family felt happy for her. They said that Sarah deserved a good man. After all the pain she had been through, the whole town believed Richard was a gift from fate for Sarah, helping her forget her sadness and move forward with life. Everyone adored Richard, and Sarah always seemed radiant and happy when he was around. However, John felt something was not right. At first, he thought maybe he was just being overly sensitive, not used to having another man in their lives. But he quickly realized that whenever it was just the two of them, Richard lost his gentle and caring demeanor. He became cold and distant, sometimes not even acknowledging John when he greeted him. Richard's words started to become sarcastic and slightly annoying. One time, when John proudly showed Richard that he had scored high on a math test, he just muttered, "Good job, but you should try harder. Not everyone stays good forever." John felt like he was being pushed out of the new life his mother was building with Richard. Family dinners that used to be just him and his mom now turned into conversations where he felt excluded. Richard always seemed to capture his mother's attention, and whenever John tried to join the conversation, Richard would become impatient, respond briefly, and then turn back to his mother to talk about their future plans. His mother, too, caught up in her newfound happiness, did not notice these changes. One night when Sarah came home late from work and Richard was alone with John, the boy discovered a terrifying truth about him. While watching cartoons in the living room, John overheard Richard talking on the phone. In the kitchen his voice was low, tense and more mysterious than ever. "The plan's still on track. Just wait until after the wedding, and everything will be taken care of. The life insurance is ready. After that we can disappear with the money." John felt his heart stop. He stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe, and sensed that there was a dark scheme at play. With his mother as the victim, Richard was not the good man he pretended to be. He was taking advantage of his mother, and might be planning to harm her to steal her money. From that moment, John became more worried and stressed than ever. He did not know what to do. Would anyone believe a kid like him? What would his mother think? What would happen if he did nothing? These questions swirled around in John's head, and as his mother's wedding day drew closer, here's for you. John knew he could not just sit back and let things happen, but he also did not know where to start. The wedding day approached, and John had to face the fact that he was the only one who could save his mother from danger. Anxiety was clear on his face as that day arrived, and all eyes turned to his mother, Sarah, in her pure white wedding dress. But John could not take his eyes off Richard, the man he knew was hiding dark secrets behind. His perfect smile had gone. John felt like he was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, but he knew he had to do something before it was too late. The big day finally arrived, and the sun's rays filtered through the stained glass windows of the grand church, casting shimmering light on the marble floor. All around the church, friends and family gathered, chatting excitedly about the ceremony and the soon-to-be married couple. Laughter and conversations echoed everywhere, but while everyone seemed cheerful, John felt a deep sense of dread. He sat quietly in a corner, clutching a small pillow bearing the wedding rings, feeling like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. John, in a small suit that fit his 9-year-old frame, looked around, trying to control his anxiety. He had made his decision. He had to stop this wedding. But how could he do it without making everything worse? He knew that no one in this crowd would believe a boy, especially on his mother's happiest day. But he also could not stand by and watch his mother be deceived and fall into the trap Richard had set. Next to him, Richard stood in a sleek black tuxedo. Smiling confidently, he looked like the perfect groom, someone anyone would think was amazing for Sarah. Everyone was charmed by Richard's looks and engaging personality. But only John knew the lies behind that smile, the scheme Richard was hiding. John felt like he was the only one who could see the true face of this man, which made him even more determined. John lowered his head, his eyes on the ring pillow in his hands, but his mind drifted back over the past months. He remembered the first time his mother introduced Richard, when everything seemed too good to be true. Back then he tried to convince himself that Richard just needed more time to warm up to him, that Richard's irritation when his mom was not around was just a misunderstanding. But after hearing that fateful phone call, John no longer had any doubts. Richard was not a good man. The sharp words Richard used, the cold stares when Sarah was not present, all proved that he did not care about John and was not truly in love with his mother, as he pretended. It was all part of a plan that John could not let happen. Looking at Richard standing on the altar, with his confident eyes and fake smile, John felt a wave of anger rise inside him. The slow wedding music began to play, signaling that the bride, Sarah, was entering the church. John gripped the pillow even tighter, his heart racing. Everyone turned toward the door where Sarah, in her stunning white wedding dress, walked forward. His mother looked radiant and happy. Her face beamed with joy, her smile suggesting she had found happiness again, after so much sorrow. But this only made John's heart ache more, knowing that his mother was being deceived. Sarah took slow steps down the aisle, covered with flowers, moving closer to the altar where Richard stood waiting. All eyes followed the bride, but John's eyes never left Richard. He stared at him, as if trying to master all his courage to speak up, to stop everything before it was too late. But his mouth could not form the words. Anxiety and fear choked him. He wondered if he had enough courage to speak the truth, in front of everyone. When Sarah reached the altar and stood beside Richard, the room fell silent. The officiant began to speak words of welcome, praising their love and commitment, but to John it was all just meaningless echoes. He could only think about the conversation he had overheard, and Richard's calculating look. Every second that passed felt like time was running out. If he did not act now, it would be too late. The officiant asked the crucial question: if anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace. The entire church fell silent, with only the sound of everyone's breath echoing. John held his breath, his hand gripping the pillow so tightly, his fingers turned white. This was his moment. This was the time for him to decide: speak the truth or let everything happen, and watch his mother be ruined by a deceitful man. John looked at his mother, Sarah, standing there, smiling happily at Richard. He could not let this happen. Taking a deep breath, John stood up, his legs shaking but determination in his eyes. He opened his mouth, his voice ringing out in the stillness. Wait, do not marry him. The entire church froze as John's shout echoed. All eyes turned toward the trembling boy, standing in the middle of the aisle. John's small legs were shaking, but he stood firm. Richard stared at John with wide eyes, a mix of surprise and anger. Sarah, John's mother, looked stunned. She could not understand why her son was interrupting the most important moment of her life. Her eyes showed confusion. Not knowing what to do, John knew that everyone in the church was waiting for an explanation from him. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but his heart pounded like a drum. "Mom, you cannot marry him," John said, his voice shaking but resolute. "He's not who you think he is." Sarah looked at her son in disbelief. "John, what are you talking about? Richard is a good man, you do not understand." Her voice trailed off as she saw the anxious look in John's eyes. But before Sarah could say more, John continued, "You do not know." "But I do. I heard him talking on the phone with someone. They were talking about money and about you, Mom. He's lying to you." The entire church erupted with murmurs and whispers. Guests began exchanging glances, trying to understand what was happening. Richard, now visibly shaken, stepped toward John, his voice low but filled with anger. "John, what nonsense are you talking about? Do not ruin your mother's wedding like this." Sarah looked bewildered. She turned to Richard and then back to her son, unable to understand why John was doing this. "John, I do not understand. Why are you saying these things? Richard loves me and loves you too." No, but John did not back down. He took a deep breath and spoke louder. "No, Mom. It's not true. I heard him talking to someone named Mark. They were talking about a plan to take your life insurance money after he hurts you." Richard stepped forward dangerously, his eyes flashing with anger that he could no longer hide. "Stop it, John. You do not know what you're talking about." He turned to Sarah, trying to regain control. "Sarah, do not listen to this. John is just a child, he does not understand. But Sarah was starting to feel something was wrong. She looked into her son's eyes, seeing the fear and seriousness in his words. John was not the type of child to make things up, and she knew that if he decided to stand up and say this, something must be very serious. Memories of the past few months began to flood back to Sarah's mind. She remembered the first time she met Richard at a friend's party. He arrived looking handsome and charming, making everyone feel like he was perfect. Sarah was immediately drawn to the confidence and care Richard showed. They began dating, and within just a few months, Richard had proposed to her. Everything happened so quickly, but Sarah thought it was because he truly loved her. She believed that, after years of suffering from the loss of her husband, she had finally found love again. However, the little things Sarah had previously overlooked now became clearer. Richard always appeared charming and kind when friends were around, but sometimes when they were alone, he became cold. He often avoided conversations about a long-term future and rarely wanted to talk about his past. Richard was also very interested in finances, frequently asking Sarah about her savings and life insurance, especially her life insurance policy. Sarah had once thought it was just a normal concern for a man worried about the future of their family, but now she started to doubt. Sarah felt a chill down her spine as the pieces began to fall into place. She looked at Richard, who was now standing tense, and then back at her son, the one person she could trust at that moment. "John," she asked gently, her voice trembling, "are you sure about what you heard?" John nodded firmly, his eyes red from holding back his emotions. "I'm sure, Mom. I do not want you to get hurt." Sarah turned to face Richard, her eyes now filled with tears. "Richard, is there something you want to explain?" Richard froze, trying to stay calm. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The anger and panic began to show on his face. Faced with Richard's suspicious silence, Sarah knew that what John was saying could be true. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the church, his entire body tense, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone in the church could feel it. Some guests started whispering to each other, doubt spreading across their faces. Sarah continued to look directly at Richard, her eyes full of a mix of pain and disbelief. Everything she had once trusted about the man standing before her was crumbling. John took a deep breath, and though his voice was shaky, he pressed on. He knew he could not stop now. "I heard him talking on the phone with someone named Mark," John said, his voice cutting through the stillness of the church. "They were discussing a plan to hurt my mom after the wedding was over." "Stop it, John!" Richard yelled, his voice now no longer calm. He turned to Sarah, trying to hold on to her. "Sarah, you have to believe me. He's just a kid. He does not understand what he's saying. I love you and I would never hurt you. Your son is confused." But Sarah did not answer immediately. She looked at Richard, her eyes blurred with tears, and then back at John. She knew her son, and John was not the type of child who made things up. John stood firm, still clutching the pillow with the rings, but he was not shaking anymore. He had spoken the truth, and now it was up to his mother to decide. Sarah, trembling, took a step toward Richard. "John said you spoke to someone named Mark. Explain it, Richard." "You need to explain this," she said, her voice still shaking, but it was clear. She was beginning to doubt his innocence. Richard took a step back, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Mark is just a friend. He was helping me with some financial issues for the wedding," Richard replied, but his voice was no longer steady. He knew he had been cornered. It was just a normal conversation about wedding insurance, nothing important. John did not let Richard continue lying. "No, it's not. I saw his messages," John shouted, gripping the pillow even tighter. He talked about how my mom would have an accident after the wedding, and then they get the insurance money. I heard everything. He's just using my mom for the money. John's words cast a heavy silence over the entire church. Some guests looked shocked, while others turned to Sarah with concerned and sympathetic expressions. Sarah felt a cold wave wash over her body. Disjointed memories flooded her mind. Richard had always wanted to know about her insurance policy, about the assets she had accumulated after her husband's death. He always seemed so concerned. But now, Sarah realized that his concern was not out of love. Sarah turned back to face Richard, tears streaming down her face. You're lying. Everything John said is true. Is not it? You only came to me for the money, did not you?" Richard could not keep his composure any longer. His face contorted with rage. His eyes flashed with defeat and bitterness. "Yes, that's right," he shouted, causing the entire church to flinch. "Yes, I wanted your money. Do you know how hard I've worked to rebuild my life? You would not understand. I lost everything, and this was my chance to get everything I needed. I was not planning on hurting anyone, but there was no room for mistakes in my plan." Sarah felt like her world was collapsing. She stepped back, her legs weak and shaky. The man she had trusted, the man she thought she would spend the rest of her life with, had now revealed his true face. Richard did not love her. He only wanted to use her, to get her life insurance money after she died. Sarah's heart shattered, not just because of Richard's betrayal, but also because her own naivety had put both her and her son in danger. Seeing Sarah's collapse, Richard knew he had lost everything. His face twisted in failure and resentment. "You do not understand, Sarah. I did not have any other choice. I needed that money to start over, but now everything's ruined." Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with fury. "You were going to hurt me to get money, and you think that's right?" Richard turned away, unable to respond. His silence was the clearest answer. But before anyone could react, Richard suddenly turned and tried to run out of the church, leaving behind a crowd of shocked and terrified guests. Richard spun around, bolting out of the church so quickly that the nearby guests had no time to react. His shoes pounded against the marble floor, creating a panicked sound. In the quiet atmosphere, everyone in the church stood up, shocked and confused. Some guests whispered to each other, unable to believe what had just happened, while others watched Richard flee, wondering how this would all end. Sarah stood frozen at the altar, tears streaming down her face. She could not believe that the man she once thought would bring her happiness was nothing more than a liar, using her for money. But more painful than anything was the realization that she had not seen the truth until her brave son spoke up. John, though trembling, stood firm. He knew this was the crucial moment, and he could not let Richard escape. Without hesitation, John ran toward the entrance, determined to stop Richard. Before he could get away, he yelled out in panic, "Someone stop him! Do not let him escape!" Everyone in the church watched as the young boy ran, and some of the men in the crowd quickly followed, trying to catch up with Richard. The atmosphere turned chaotic, with the sound of footsteps echoing everywhere, along with rushed words and frantic shouts. Richard, now outside the church, raced down the steps trying to find a way out, but as he reached the last step, young John had already run ahead, blocking his path. Although John's small body could not physically stop an adult, his courageous act caused enough surprise to slow Richard down. "Do not run," John shouted, standing in front of Richard. "You're not going to get away." Richard glared down at John, his eyes filled with anger and frustration. "Get out of my way, kid," he growled, trying to shove John aside. But John did not move, staring straight into Richard's eyes, without any sign of fear at that moment. The men from the church caught up. Grabbing hold of Richard, he struggled, but ultimately could not break free from their grasp. Richard knew he had lost. He screamed in desperation, but there was no escape from the hands holding him tight. Meanwhile, Sarah made her way down the church steps, her legs trembling and weak. She looked at the scene in front of her, Richard being restrained and her son John standing there, his face sweaty but determined. A wave of emotion hit her, both from the pain of Richard's betrayal and the pride she felt for her son's bravery. "John," she called his name, her voice hoarse with emotion. She stepped closer, and when she reached him, she knelt down and hugged him tightly. "I'm sorry, John. I'm sorry. I did not believe you from the beginning." John hugged his mother tightly, feeling her warmth and love. "I just wanted to protect you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I did not want you to get hurt." Sarah sobbed uncontrollably, but this time her tears were not just from pain, but from love and gratitude. "I'm so proud of you, John. You saved me." At that moment, a police car pulled up in front of the church, its red and blue lights flashing brightly across the street. Two officers stepped out of the car and quickly made their way to Richard, who was still being restrained by the wedding guests. They immediately handcuffed Richard, even as he continued to struggle in vain. One of the officers approached Sarah and John asking, "We received a report. Can someone explain what's going on?" Sarah, still emotional, tried to stand up, holding John's hand tightly. She took a deep breath, looked at the officer, then at her son. "My son John uncovered the truth. My fiancé Richard was deceiving us. He had a plan to harm me after the wedding, to get my life insurance money." The officer nodded, taking down Sarah's statement and glancing toward Richard, who was now being led toward the police car. "We'll continue our investigation, but John's actions help stop a crime." The officer said, "That boy is very brave." John said nothing, but he felt a great sense of relief as he watched Richard being taken away. It was finally over. He had not only saved his mother from danger, but had also protected their small family from a terrifying con artist. Sarah hugged John again, this time unable to hold back her tears. "You saved me, John," she whispered. "Thank you, my boy." John smiled weakly, feeling his heart lightened like never before. Their lives would change after today, but at least they still had each other. Richard was handcuffed and placed in the police car, but he kept screaming and struggling in helpless rage. His eyes were filled with fury and despair, as if he could not accept that his perfect plan had been foiled by a young boy. The guests still stood around the church, watching the police car drive away in stunned silence. The tension in the air had not completely dissipated, as what had just happened was too shocking to process. Immediately, Sarah stood by John, her eyes still red from crying. Even though they were now safe from immediate danger, the sense of loss still overwhelmed her. All the trust she had placed in Richard had now completely crumbled. The man she once thought was her way out of loneliness had turned out to be a fraud, someone who had planned to ruin her life. Her heart was broken not only by the betrayal, but also by the pain of realizing she had not seen Richard's true nature until John spoke up. John stood quietly, his eyes fixed on the police car taking Richard away. He felt relieved but also deeply exhausted. After everything, John knew he had done the right thing. He had saved his mother from a terrible fate. However, a part of him still felt conflicted between the guilt of ruining the wedding and the pride of protecting his family. He could not shake the feeling that without his bravery, things would have unfolded just as Richard had planned. Sarah turned to look at her son, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. "You saved me, John," she said, her voice still shaky. "I'm sorry I did not listen to you from the start." John looked at his mother, his eyes shining, but he tried to stay calm. "I do not blame you, Mom," he replied. "I just wanted you to be safe." Sarah bent down and hugged John tightly. She knew that no matter what the future held, the two of them had overcome a huge challenge. Their love and trust had only grown stronger than ever. She silently thanked John not just for his courage, but for always believing in what was right, even when she had not realized it. As Sarah and John walked back toward the church, the guests began to quietly leave. A few people approached Sarah, hugging her and whispering words of comfort. "You're lucky to have John," one of her friends said. "That boy did what no one else dared to do." Sarah nodded, feeling her heart warm a little. "Yes, I'm so proud of my son," she replied, her eyes still following John. However, shortly after that, they received a phone call from the police. Despite being handcuffed and held in the car, Richard had somehow managed to escape. When the police car passed through a remote area, he had taken advantage of a moment of distraction and fled into a nearby forest. This plunged Sarah and John back into a state of anxiety. They had thought it was all over, but now Richard had once again become a looming threat. The police immediately launched a large-scale manhunt, deploying helicopters and search dogs to find Richard. Sarah felt a new wave of fear wash over her. She could not stop thinking about whether Richard would come back to seek revenge on her and her son. John could sense his mother's fear, but he tried to reassure her. "Mom, do not worry. The police will catch him, we'll be fine." But even as John said this, he felt the tension tightening around him. He remembered the look in Richard's eyes when he was captured, eyes filled with anger and resentment. John knew that Richard was not the kind of person to give up easily, and this made him constantly afraid of what might happen next. A week passed. The police still have not found any trace of Richard. The search continued, but there were no signs of him. Sarah and John tried to return to their daily lives, but the fear remained. Sarah had hired workers to install a new security system for their house, and she avoided going out at night, unless John or a friend was with her. Every night before going to bed, she checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was securely locked. John too felt the tension in the air, but he always tried to appear calm, so as not to worry his mother. He knew she was under a lot of pressure, and he did not want to be a burden on her. Instead, John focused on his school work and continued with his normal activities. But he could not completely shake the feeling that one day Richard might show up again. One day, when the police visited to check on their situation, Sarah could not hold back her fear any longer. She asked the officer in a trembling voice, "Are you sure Richard will not come back? I do not know how much longer I can live with this anxiety." The officer reassured her, but Sarah knew that they could not guarantee their complete safety until Richard was caught. "We'll do everything we can to find him," the officer said, "but rest assured, we're keeping a close eye on the situation. If there's any sign of him, we'll notify you immediately." Sarah nodded, feeling her fears not entirely eased, but knowing she had no choice but to keep living, to keep waiting, and to hope that everything would end safely. As the days passed, with no new information about Richard, Sarah and John's anxiety grew heavier. Even though the police had increased patrols and searches, there were no clues about Richard's whereabouts. Sarah felt like she was living in constant fear, and every time she stepped outside, she felt as though she was being watched. John, although trying to remain strong, could not avoid the tension, always paying close attention to every sound or strange movement around the house. However, one afternoon, Sarah and John received important news from the police. The officer arrived at their home with a serious but hopeful expression. "We have new information about Richard," the officer said, looking directly at Sarah. "We found some important documents related to his plan, and even more, we've tracked down a man named Mark." Mark the man John had overheard in Richard's phone conversation was the key to uncovering the entire scheme. The police had followed the documents on Richard's computer and found secret transactions between Richard and Mark, who was revealed to be involved in multiple fraud cases in the past. The officer explained that Mark was Richard's accomplice, helping him devise the insurance scheme, and may have been advising Richard from the beginning. "We've arrested Mark in a small town not far from here," the officer continued. "He's confessed everything. He and Richard planned this for months. The main target was your life insurance." Sarah, "Richard forged several documents related to your insurance and financial contracts. Once you died in an accident, the money would go to Richard, and he would disappear with it." Sarah felt a chilling wave of fear run down her spine as she listened to those words. She had suspected the truth, but hearing these things from the police made the horror all the more real. She turned to look at John, her eyes filled with gratitude for her son's timely warning. If John had not discovered the scheme, she could have become a victim of this evil plan. "But Richard has not been caught yet, has he?" John asked, the worry clear in his voice. The officer nodded, saying, "That's right, he's still on the run, but with Mark in custody, we believe we'll find Richard soon. He has nowhere left to hide." The police investigation revealed even more disturbing details about Richard's past. He had been involved in various schemes, using fake identities to target wealthy or financially independent women. After getting close, he would build trust and eventually defraud them through insurance policies or assets. Mark had been his longtime accomplice, always working behind the scenes to help Richard with his schemes, but this time they had decided to carry out a bigger plan. In the following days, Sarah and John could not shake their anxiety. Although Mark had been arrested, the fact that Richard was still out there made them feel unsafe. The police advised Sarah and John to be cautious, to limit going out unless necessary, and to stay in contact with them. The investigation continued, and the police had also increased security measures for their family. One night, Sarah sat beside John as he prepared for bed. She gently brushed his hair, her eyes still filled with worry. "Are you okay, John? I know this has been very hard for you," she asked, her voice choking with emotion. John looked at his mother and nodded. "I'm okay. I just worry that Richard might come back. I do not want him to hurt you." Sarah hugged John tightly, feeling the deep concern in her son. "I'm scared too, John, but the police are working hard to catch him. We'll get through this. You saved me once, and I promise I'll always protect you, no matter what happens." The two of them sat in silence, listening to the wind rustling through the trees outside the window. In that moment, they felt like they were standing against the world, but at the same time they knew that their courage and love would help them overcome any obstacle. Sarah knew that they were not just mother and son, but an unbreakable team, one that had proven its strength in the most dangerous of times. Weeks after Mark's arrest, and as the investigation continued, there was still no new news about Richard. The silence hung over Sarah and John like a ghost. Although the police had done everything they could to track Richard down, he seemed to have vanished without a trace. Day after day, the feeling of tension and unease crept into their lives. They had to live in a constant state of vigilance, locking doors every time they left, never revealing their daily routine. Sarah began to return to work, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy and not let fear control her life. She knew she had to stay strong, not just for herself but for John too. Each day Sarah tried to create moments of joy for John, from cooking delicious meals to watching movies together and taking him on walks in the nearby park. However, it was not hard to see that both of them were still carrying the deep worry about Richard, the man who had yet to be caught. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning up after dinner, John sat at the table, his eyes on his homework book, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere. He was quiet and reflective, something Sarah rarely saw in her son. She walked over to John, sat down and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about, John?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. John looked up at his mother, his eyes shimmering with thoughts that he struggled to express. "Mom, do you think Richard will come back?" John's question pierced Sarah's heart like a needle. Her son had been burdened by fear for too long, and Sarah knew he needed reassurance. Sarah took a deep breath, then spoke with sincerity. "I do not know John, but I can promise you this. We will always be ready whether he comes back or not. We will not let fear run our lives. We've already gotten through the worst of it, and will keep moving forward." John remained silent, seeming to contemplate his mother's words. Finally he nodded slightly and said, "I just want things to go back to how they were, when we did not have to be afraid of anything." Sarah smiled, though her smile carried a bit of sadness. "I want that too, John. But sometimes what happens in life changes us. What's important is that we do not let fear or pain control us. You've been braver than I ever expected, and I'm so proud of you." After that conversation, the two of them decided that, whether Richard returned or not, they would not let fear dominate their lives. Sarah and John began to participate in more activities, rediscovering joy in the small things. They joined gatherings with friends, participated in sports clubs, and even took a short trip to a place they had never been before. This not only helped them relieve stress, but also strengthened their bond as mother and son. One day, nearly 3 months after Mark's arrest, Sarah received a phone call from the police that she had been waiting for. All this time Richard had been caught. He was found hiding in an abandoned house in the outskirts of a neighboring state, where he had been living in hiding since escaping from the police car. The police team arrested Richard without any resistance. Upon hearing this news, Sarah felt as though a massive weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She sat down in her chair, unable to believe that it was finally over. The officer on the phone confirmed that Richard would be facing numerous charges, including fraud, attempted murder, and evading the law. "You and your son are safe now," the officer reassured. "We'll notify you when the trial begins, but he will not have the chance to harm anyone anymore." Sarah thanked the officer and hung up the phone. The entire house fell into silence, but this time it was the silence of relief. No longer the silence of fear that had haunted them for months. Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the sky and taking a deep breath. She felt as though the sky was bluer today, the air lighter and easier to breathe. "John," Sarah called out, feeling joy swelling in her heart. "I got that." John came running down the stairs, looking at his mother with surprise. "What's going on, Mom?" Sarah smiled, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "Richard has been caught, son. It's finally over." John stood still for a moment, not saying a word, but then a smile slowly spread across his face. "Really, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with relief. When he saw his mother nod, John rushed to hug her tightly, as if he never wanted to let go. "We're safe now, Mom," John whispered, feeling the happiness he had not felt in months. "Yes, John, "We're safe now," Sarah replied, hugging her son tightly. A few months later, when Richard's trial took place, Sarah and John were both present to testify, with the undeniable evidence against him. Richard was sentenced to many years in prison. It was the day that mother and son officially closed the painful chapter of their lives. They left the courtroom with a sense of relief, knowing that their lives would no longer be haunted by Richard's shadow. As the two walked out of the courthouse, Sarah turned to John, smiling with pride. "We did it, John. It's all behind us now." John nodded, feeling as though he had completed a long, challenging journey. "I think so too, Mom, and I know that no matter what happens, we'll always have each other." Sarah smiled, filled with happiness. "That's right, my son. We'll always be a team forever." Mother and son left the courthouse, stepping into the bright sunlight, knowing that their future would be full of hope and peace after the trial. Everything seemed to lighten for Sarah and John. The two of them slowly returned to their normal lives, but with a new perspective, a life no longer filled with fear of Richard haunting their nights. After all the turmoil, they decided it was time to leave the town that held too many painful memories and start fresh somewhere new. One day Sarah talked to John about the idea of moving. She looked at her son, hoping he would be okay with such a big change. "John, I think we need a fresh start. A place that does not remind us of everything that happened. I want us to live in peace, and I believe a new place will bring us that." John thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "I think so too, Mom. I want things to change, not to have to remember Richard anymore. We can start over, and I think we'll do well." Sarah smiled, sensing the maturity in her son's words. "I'm so proud of you, John. You've been through so much, and I know we'll be stronger because of it." A few weeks later, the two of them found a small house in a peaceful town near the ocean. It was a lovely home with a little garden, where Sarah and John could grow flowers and vegetables. They began packing up their things, cleaning up and preparing for their new life. Everything was going smoothly, and both were excited about what the future would bring. As moving day approached, Sarah and John sat together on their last evening in the old house. They watched the sunset through the window, the view radiant but quiet, much like the memories of their past. Sarah remembered the beautiful memories of her late husband, and now she also felt at peace with everything that had happened. "I'll miss this place," Sarah said, her voice soft but thoughtful. "But I think we're ready for a new journey. We need a place to start over, not out of fear or avoidance, but to build a better future." John sat quietly beside his mother, looking out of the sky. He did not say much, but his eyes reflected agreement and anticipation for their new life. "Mom, I think we'll do well, and I'm glad we have a new place to call home." Sarah turned to her son, smiling proudly. "Yes, John. Home is where we have each other, not where we live and will build a happy new life." After they moved to the new town, life for Sarah and John slowly stabilized. They quickly made friends with their neighbors and felt that this was truly the peaceful place they had always been searching for. Sarah began working remotely, and John started at a new school. He quickly made friends and joined many sports and school clubs. John's smooth transition into his new life made Sarah feel more reassured than ever. One morning, as they sat eating breakfast on their porch, the ocean sparkling in the sunlight and the gentle sound of waves crashing in the distance, John looked at his mother and smiled, his face free of the worry and tension that had plagued him for months. "Mom, I really like this place," John said. "I feel like we've truly moved past the past and have a new life." Not Sarah nodded, feeling happiness spread through her heart. "I do too. This is the place where we can start fresh, where there's only peace and joy. The two of them continued to enjoy the simple, quiet days in their new home. Every morning they would take walks on the beach, and every evening they would watch movies and play games together. Sarah felt like she had found joy in life again, realizing that no matter what happened, their love and bond would always be the foundation for everything. Life for Sarah and John had become so much better. After all the hardships, they had learned valuable lessons about love, courage, and the ability to overcome adversity. Facing those challenges had made them stronger, and now they could confidently move forward, without fear or being haunted by the past. One evening Sarah sat outside on the porch, listening to the sound of the waves in the quiet night air. John sat nearby reading a book. He had grown so much since everything had happened, and Sarah knew how lucky she was to have such a wonderful son. She looked at him with eyes full of love and pride. "You know, John," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "you are the best thing that's ever happened to me. Thank you for always being there for me, and for always being so brave." John smiled, putting his book down and walking over to hug his mother tightly. "I love you so much, Mom, and I promise that no matter what happens, we'll always have each other." Under the starry sky and the sound of the ocean, Sarah and John knew they had overcome the biggest challenges. Their new life had begun, and the future ahead promised only joy, love, and peace. But John's story proved that even a young boy can change a life, with courage and determination to stand up for the truth. Thanks to John's actions, a dark scheme was exposed, and mother and son were finally able to find peace in their new life. The important message here is, standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, is always the path to happiness and protection for the ones we love. If this story has touched you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you do not miss more inspiring stories.